So the ideas in this video were kind of taken from Mary Daly's Gynecology. So if you're interested in that, I would suggest, or if you're interested in these topics, I would suggest picking up that book and checking it out. I was speaking to a friend earlier about the witch hunts in Europe, and just kind of talking about how modern gynecology and even modern medicine and a lot of things in our society come from the fact that all of this brutalization, murder of women happened in Europe during the Enlightenment period. And I think it's pretty interesting that this time is called the Enlightenment, when they were savagely killing women for basically no good reason that I can fathom. Well, they had their reasons, and I'm going to get into that. It's a mistake, I feel, to say that these women weren't witches, because, I mean, that's often said that, oh, this was just religious superstition. It's not the case that they weren't witches, but the term witch comes from a term meaning woman with wisdom. So basically, at the time, people aren't really familiar with this either. They think that women were just basically chattel during the Middle Ages. Up until this point, it's not actually the case. There were many opportunities for women to live apart from men, especially if they had a craft like being a healer, and many women became healers. And they had knowledge of plants, healing broken bones, dealing with sick, with elderly people, with the dying, and also, very importantly, how to deal with female sexual health problems, and also to deal with childbirth. So they were very important women with status in the society because they had this sacred knowledge that most people don't know this, but it wasn't that common that males would be healers at the time. So what happened, interestingly enough, is that these women began to pose a threat to the Catholic Church. And how that happened was that the Catholic Church had owned quite a bit of property in the Americas, and they were harvesting sugar. And this was being imported to Europe. Now, the wise women, or the healers, were very obviously seeing in their patients that the sugar was causing all manner of health problems in them. And we know today that sugar causes a massive health problems. And even though it's like completely saturated in our diets. So they would tell their patients to stop eating sugar. And this was causing the Catholic Church to lose quite a bit of money, because people did. They trusted these wise women. They stopped eating sugar. And because of this, they basically were posing the threat, and they had to be done away with. They were challenging the prophets of the Catholic Church. And, you know, apart from that kind of thing, you also see the development at the time of these elaborate court systems which hadn't existed before for trials. They had to have note takers, they had to have all manner of people doing all manner of positions, because the witch trials were so elaborate. And, you know, I'm sure people are familiar with what happened in the witch trials. I mean, torture was implemented, and, you know, people believe that if you confess to being a witch that you were spared. That's not necessarily true. You know, most of the time, it didn't matter if you confessed or not. You would be killed for being a witch. And apart from that, apart from being killed for being a witch, you would also be subject to, like, horrible torture, which included rape, which isn't really included as a form of torture at the time, but this was another way for men to kind of, like, act out their, like, sexual fetishes and fantasies. They would, like, basically sexually torture and humiliate these women. And I'm going to be talking about this mainly as a female thing, because although there were males burned as witches, it was very much the case that this was a crime against women. And it was generally only males that got in the way of this happening, or were somehow affiliated with female witches, or who owned some property that churches wanted, and this includes Catholic and Protestant churches. So you Protestants out there need to stop acting as though there isn't blood on your hands, because there's tons of it. So yeah, there was this incredible brutalization and murder of thousands of women, although it's sometimes speculated that there were millions of women killed in Europe. I mean, there were villages and towns where you could go that there were no women left. That's how bad it was. And it definitely, I think, sent a message into the psychology of women remaining that still exists to this day. So I talked about how kind of the court systems were set up, and this is kind of the start of our modern court systems. That's why they're so elaborate today. This created a ton of jobs. You have to remember that. This was a huge profit-making venture for the church and small companies that were getting started at the beginning of capitalism, basically, how it was kind of growing. Then you also have to understand that the midwifery was then kind of lost. All of this kind of sacred knowledge has been with human beings for thousands upon thousands of years on how to deal with common problems and how to use plants to heal. That was all lost. I mean, you're hard-pressed to find people who have any knowledge of this stuff, and the knowledge that people do have is generally limited at this point, because so much of it was just destroyed with these women's bodies. And so this is part of the reason why modern medicine needs to be mistrusted to a certain extent, and you need to be wary and kind of take your own health into your own hands and learn how to be kind of in control of it to a certain extent. I'm not saying you shouldn't visit a doctor and that kind of thing. I think that's important, but you also need to take responsibility for your own health in a lot of ways, and do things for yourself. So I talked about the rise of the court systems and how women were brutalized to protect the church's profits. I also wanted to talk about gynecology, which is an aspect of modern medicine that didn't exist at the time because midwifery was destroyed. Gynecology is a very male medical profession. It arose during this time to replace midwifery, and it's very much based on techniques and methods that are not holistic and really have nothing to do with relating to the female body. Because of this, there were a whole host of problems that women began having in childbirth. It actually became more difficult for women to give birth after this period, because there was really no empathy, and like the methods they would use to help women give birth were actually damaging to their bodies. One development that came were these clamps that they would shove into women's vaginas when they were giving birth and, pull the baby out. Now, this was obviously traumatic on several levels to both female and child, and oftentimes it would injure the fetus or the baby coming out. But also, what it created was a lot of incontinence in women. So, basically, what would happen is with the shoving of these clamps into women, they would tear the vaginal walls in between the bladder and the rectum. And people don't realize how fragile that tissue is if it's torn too much, which often can happen during like a very young girl giving childbirth or through methods like this. Women become incontinent, which means they can't control their bodily functions. So feces and urine will be passing through the vagina and not through their proper tubes. So basically they're just in a constant state of filth. Now this was posing obviously serious problems. It meant women really couldn't move around or do the activities that they needed to do, like to take care of the home, which was their job, in a proper manner. So how these fuckers decided to deal with this problem was to begin experimenting, fixing the problem on African slave women in the Americas. This started happening in the 19th century, that they would basically take these women and cut them up and then sew them back together to see how they would fit, and to see if this would solve the problems. And this was done without anesthesia and without the women's consent, of course, because they were slaves. It's a horribly brutal process. They would actually even cut women open and take out their uteruses, and horrible, fucked up vivisection to these women's bodies. And, oftentimes a lot of these women would die of infections and things like that from this horrible practice. And then, of course, when they perfected it, then they started, using these methods on white women, which they continue to use to this day. And they also sometimes still use those fucking clamps during childbirth. It's a really awful thing to look at, to see just how much has been lost in terms of our history and in terms of our sacred knowledge that was with us for so long as human beings, but also to see just how these systems are really built off of the brutalization and murder of so many women. And this isn't really known. I mean, I had to read this book, for example, to come into contact with some of these things. I mean, some of them I already heard about, but the fact that, this was profitable to the church, I had no idea that they were, doing this to maintain their money in a lot of ways. So I'm going to leave a link to a video called The Burning Times in the low bar if you're interested in learning more about the witch burnings and what happened at that time. Yeah, I'll speak to y'all later.